These are very moving, aren't they?
Yes, they are, yes.
They're going to be sliding off. Welcome, everybody. My name's Giles Fraser. I'm a parish priest in South London and have long had an interest in violence. And I've been asked to just chair a conversation between some experts. We're allowed to have experts these days on the subject of violence. And you're all going to see the play later. I understand that it's no spoiler to say at the beginning, quite near the beginning of the play, the main character asks for a discussion to take place. I think it's an online discussion.
Well, conversation.
An online conversation. Encourages an online conversation about violence. And that's what we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to introduce panellists, guests, and we're going to have a conversation for, I don't know, half an hour or maybe more, see how it goes. And as soon as possible, I'm going to try and bring you in. If there's a point where you are just busting a gut, we're small enough just to step in and just to put your hand up or say something. And if you will allow me, I'll either just wait a minute, I'll say, or I'll bring you in. But I think we're small enough to have quite an informal conversation about that. But there will be a point about half an hour in that I'll ask for questions and we'll do it that way, if that makes sense. But I think we're intimate enough to, if you want to interrupt, then I'll either allow it or I won't, if you understand me. And if you, I'm sorry about that. So, without any further ado, can I introduce, to start with, in the middle, Vivian Jabri, who's Professor of International Politics at the War Studies Department. She says War Studies, not Defence Studies. We've had a discussion about this. At the War Department, as I like to call it, of King's College London. And expert in international politics and war, that's exactly what we need. Claire van Velsen, at the end, was until May a consultant psychiatrist in forensic psychotherapy at the Forensic Personality Disorder Service in the East London NHS Foundation Trust. And you're going to talk a bit about your work, which will be absolutely fascinating. And then to complete the diverse cast, Stephen Scott Bottoms, who's Professor of Contemporary Theatre and Performance at University of Manchester. That was my credit list, that's going away. Stephen, can I start with you and say, you know a little bit about the work of this playwright. Could you just give us some context and some background for what we're about to see?
So Christopher Shin is a playwright who, I can't remember his exact age, but he's younger than me. And his first play, Four, was staged at the Royal Court Theatre in 1998. And since then, actually, the Royal Court supported quite a few of his other plays. And then the Donmar Warehouse also did the world premieres of it. He's quite interesting as an American.
He's American, isn't he?
He's an American playwright, but it's quite interesting because a number of his, in fact, the majority of his plays are premiered in London, and he feels that that's because a lot of American theatres, particularly not-for-profit theatres, are afraid of overtly political material these days because they don't want to scare their sponsors, and a lot of American theatres are dependent on subscription audiences where people paid like a season ticket to be there, and if something's a bit controversial, then they'll go, "Ooh, I don't want to go back there." So there's something about London theatres that he regards as willing to take more risks, rightly or wrongly, which is quite interesting. But a number of his plays, he's essentially a realist playwright, and what he does is combine, if you like, the public and the private in really quite interesting ways. So, for example, a play called Where Do We Live, which was first done in 2002, was a direct response to 9/11 just a few months earlier, and is set in a New York apartment very similar to the one that Shin himself presumably lived in or lives in, both before and after the moment of the World Trade Center coming down, and as the war effort is gearing up towards Afghanistan. And the really interesting thing about this is that the events of 9/11 and the subsequent build to war are barely mentioned in the play, and you get these little hints of it. But instead, what you've got is a lot of interpersonal tension between people living on either side of a hallway in an apartment block. And so he's playing with, in terms of violence, there's that question of the big violence, if you like, of the spectacle of aeroplanes crashing into the towers, but also the violence of knocking on somebody's door uninvited, perhaps, and demanding things from them, or the question of whether you will then give or slam the door in their face and so on, is and he actually makes a direct connection in that play between Afghanistan, about to be invaded, war-torn, lots of tribes all at odds with each other, and New York, lots of tribes all at odds with each other, rather than the United States. Okay, so he's very interested in the differences between people, but also the sameness between us, if you like, and the things that we all share. He's interested in trying to overcome the boundaries between people, I think, in different ways in his work, but also where that I've lost my train of thought completely. That there are many forms of violence and many forms of tension between people that he explores in his plays.
Brilliant. So we've got a bit of Christopher Shin.
Yeah.
And you haven't seen this play.
I haven't. No,
and you're going to see it tonight for the first time.
Don't want to be spoiled.
You have seen this play,
yes.
okay, haven't you? Yeah, can you don't talk about play because we're going to keep off spoilers, but can you talk about just talk a little bit about your work and how presumably in your work you deal with or have dealt with a number of violent individuals?
Yeah, I'm trained as a psychiatrist, and then I specialised in forensic psychiatry, so people who've committed offences. And I suppose I then got intrigued, why am I interested in above-averagely violent and perverse men? So I thought that I'd better understand that bit, and I trained as an analyst. So I'm slightly unusual in being a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, because, and I suppose the point of that is understanding the meaning of it. As Holmes said to Watson, what is this cycle of misery and despair that we all get into? And that, so that I have spent many years assessing and treating mainly men, but also some women who have committed significant and severe acts of violence. And, and I worked in a unit where we tried to work with that. And I suppose I link it to aspects of destructiveness. But I would like to say that, of course, in a way, that question, why are we interested in above-averagely violent and perverse people, is actually not just limited to me, but, crime fiction, etc., is all about, in a way, people wanting to digest or kind of process violence. And what is most interesting is that, of course, violent acts, as you will say, are not just carried out by psychopaths or criminals, but that actually it doesn't take a lot for people to become violent. You just have to look at Rwanda or, multiple similar things. And so I'm interested in the function that violence plays for people. And I suppose in my work with the men that I worked with, I was interested in how hard it was for them to give it up. How hard it was to find a different way of processing feelings. So often you hear on the radio, and quite rightly, if only there were more facilities for prisoners. And it's absolutely true. But it's also true that I worked in a really well-funded unit with really skilled people. And yet, the men found it so hard to give up the criminality and delinquency. And I'm interested in that. And I think that, I'm not going to make a spoiler for the play, but one of the aspects of the play is somebody wanting to do something about violence and finding that it's a lot more complicated than you think it might be.
You've mentioned a couple of times men there, and of course there is a sort of, one thinks of violence as a particular pathology of the masculine, but it's also not just the masculine. But why the masculine?
I mean, I think that, and that's a very interesting, because you could say that the most striking thing about violence is that it's overwhelmingly carried out by men. But saying that, you also have to say, well, women perhaps express violence in a different way against their own bodies. And I would say that self-harm is a form of violence. And perhaps and against the products of their bodies, their babies, their children sometimes. And so, you know, most young babies are killed by mothers.
Last time I was on the stage was on Medea.
So I think it's a very, and I think you'd have to go into a different discussion. I think there's a very interesting discussion to have about why it takes that form. But that, as I said, in a way, I like to be a bit less sort of categorising and sort of think of violence as a form of destructiveness. And that for men, for reasons, and, you know, as I say, I want to be a lecture on its own, but that violence against others is particularly masculine.
There's lots to come back to already there, but let's leave that and let's have three different points. And perhaps you talk a little bit about your work and your fascination with this subject.
Yeah. Well, I've spent my career writing about violence, but specifically political violence. So the question is, how does violence relate to politics? What does it do to politics, and specifically international politics in my case? Violence is a very difficult thing to capture and to pin down. The meaning of the concept of violence has actually changed historically with time. So if you go back to, for example, St. Augustine, he would recognize the violence of war. And what's really paradoxical is that in our time, the violence of war, that war is about killing, has actually been extracted from the meaning and the understanding of violence, so that it's very common for people in the public sphere and commentators, including academics, to talk about, for example, our war, our peace building, our state building over there, and their violence.
I see.
So it's a very interesting kind of anamnesis, if you like, that the violence of war is not there when it comes to, if you like, the violence of the intervener in Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq and so on. So that we don't talk about Tony Blair as having committed violence.
Some people do.
Some people do, exactly. Some people do, against 600,000 people in Iraq. But we do talk about the violence of, let us say, the figure of the terrorist. So it's an interesting paradox that in St. Augustine's day there was a recognition of violence as being an extraordinary event. The other related issue in terms of violence is that we have a tendency now in late modernity to, in a sense, render violence a normal act, a normal thing. And it is precisely because we've extracted it from understandings of what war does. But one interesting way of normalizing violence is to think about structural violence. So a lot of people talk about the violence of, for example, the capitalist system and so on. And I understand, just reading the reviews of the play, I'll see the play this evening, I understand that at the end of the day he starts to, in a sense, conceptualize violence in that way. But to so change the meaning of violence away from that act of violence and towards a kind of structural, abstracted understanding is really to take out the responsibility of the subject of violence and the politics that that subject is enacting as they enact the violent injury against the other. And then the third point I'd like to raise, in a sense, emerges from Hannah Arendt and the way that Arendt writes about violence. So for Arendt, there is an absolute distinction between violence on the one hand and politics as a form of action on the other. And this is very interesting because it would suggest that when the act of violence ends, somehow politics begins. Right? There's a very close association between Arendt, when she says this, and actually Clausewitz's famous understanding of war as a continuation of policy through other means. But Franz Fanon, enters the picture in here, enters the conversation, if you like, and kind of disrupts this rather easy separation between the act of violence and the act of politics that Hannah Arendt really wants to have, and for good reason. She wants to have the separation. But what Fanon does, the move that Fanon makes, is to say, but that act of violence within the colonial context, in a sense, enables the subject of violence to emerge onto the political sphere, so that violence comes to constitute the subject of politics. And in a weird kind of very interesting way, interesting for me as an international political theorist and a critical theorist, what's interesting about that is that when you go back to Hannah Arendt, and in a sense you're carrying on your shoulder Frantz Fanon, you see a proximity between Hannah Arendt and Fanon in her writing on revolution. So that when she is writing about, for example, the American Revolution, which she hails as the real revolution, the founding moment of the Republic, if you like, she's not making that hard distinction between the act of violence and the act of politics. So these are the...
She did her PhD... Hannah Arendt did her PhD on St Augustine. That's right, isn't it?
She...
Is that it? I think that's right, isn't it?
It is right.
Yes.
And partly right. But she does write about Augustine. She is influenced by Augustine. And Augustine himself as a figure is interesting in this subject. And he's not only interesting in relation to the subject when it comes to just war thinking, but he's also interesting in relation to the subject because he brings up the question of self-reflection when it comes to, for example, having this conversation about violence. So this idea of self-reflection in relation to what the structures we're situated in, the institutions, for him, of course, the Catholic Church, the structures we are situated in a sense, demand a reflection in terms of the individual self and how the individual self relates and responds to the violence that is all around us and that's taking place in our name much of the time.
Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I think this is it's a fascinating question that was raised fairly recently by Steven Pinker in a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he has this theory that we are, over time, over hundreds of years, over centuries, becoming a much less violent society. We're much less violent. If you count in terms of violence, now is the best time to be living in human history. This is his idea. Now, I think the technical term for that is bollocks. But I wonder.
Glad you used that.
But I'm a neutral chair, so I can't say that. What do you have a view about this? Having a long view about war? Maybe we'll come to other people if they've got anything to say about that.
Well, I would say ditto, following
Okay.
the technical term that you used in relation to Steven Pinker. I have a huge problem with it. Why? Because once again, it misconceives the notion of violence, where it takes place. It seems to, in a sense, collude with a hierarchical understanding of those who commit violence and those who are subject to violence, so that the violence that takes place in the civil war in the Congo, for example, that has claimed over more than 1 million people already. The destruction of the Middle East as a region has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but it kind of seems to inadvertently collude with the idea that we don't count their dead, unless you specifically go out to make that calculation. Rather, what he is counting is, if you like, the everyday notion of our lives. The everyday aspect of people across the world is a life that does not involve that physical aspect of violence, but that's such a crass use of, a statistical notion. But also, he comes from the idea that ever since the Enlightenment, as we were talking about earlier, ever since the Enlightenment, somehow humanity has progressed to this phase where we've done away with violence, forgetting thereby that colonial violence, the dispossession of populations, which was accompanied by direct violence, he's forgetting the colonial violence that comes with modernity, so that we can't talk about modernity without at the same time historically talking about coloniality. He's somehow forgetting about the Holocaust, which, is a monumental event right in the middle of where the Enlightenment project emerges. So it kind of makes me very angry when we invited him actually at King's. He came and gave a talk at King's and got a lot of very hard questions.
Cleo, can we be cured of this propensity that human beings seem to have perennially to kill each other, to beat each other up, to commit violence against each other?
I don't think so. I mean, it seems to me that and there is debate certainly in psychoanalysis about whether or not you can talk about sort of innate destructiveness. I do think it's there, but I also feel that you can help manage it, and that's where politics and society is very important. How you structure your prisons, how you structure your society, it matters, because that's how you manage it. And I suppose I feel with some sympathy with Steven Pinker, because I think there are aspects, certainly in our culture, we haven't got the death penalty anymore. We don't have the kind of systematic violence that was just de rigueur in schools, etc. There's more awareness of it, but I'm not saying on a global level, but that it does feel that there's a kind of an idea that you can kind of legislate it out.
It's true about the school and the public sphere, isn't it? It's less acceptable. I mean, I was beaten a lot when I was a child at school. I mean, the cane and all those forms of violence were just seen as perfectly acceptable forms of. Nowadays, if my daughter's here in the audience, and it's like a completely different education system.
But also, people think violence can be good. I mean, if you think about films, for example, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You have the bad psychopath who's, and the ugly one, and then you have the good one. That's the character played by Clint Eastwood, as in many films. So people have an idea that actually it's important to be, that violence, as you say, in revolution can come out of, that can be important in order to further things. So people do have a notion of the kind of good violence.
Yeah, and the I mean, this is the just war thing, isn't it? I mean, and we've seen that within the last 50 years with the invasion of Iraq, for example, being justified, the invasion of Afghanistan being justified in terms of human rights. The idea that the people of Iraq are being oppressed by Saddam Hussein, which no doubt they were, or that women, particularly in Afghanistan, are being forced to wear burqas by the Taliban and all this. So somehow to enact violence in those cultures, even though we have no business being in those cultures, is good, is a matter of human rights, and that's the real kind of. And Christopher Shin, as a playwright, is very interested in those kind of paradoxes. I mean, one of his plays, for example, Now or Later, which is set during a presidential election, and it's actually the night of the president. The Democratic candidate is about to be elected, and his son. It turns out that he's at an Ivy League college. It turns out he's done something at a party at college that he shouldn't have done, that's now been uploaded as a video to YouTube, and it's going to cause an international incident unless the son apologises and says, I didn't really mean it. And the son, and specifically, it's kind of playing off, if you remember the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which caused violence in various parts of the world. And specifically, it's this idea that Muslims will be offended if you don't apologise, and this will be a very bad start to this American presidency because we want to be nice to the world, right? And the son refuses to back down on the basis that he feels that would be, although he finds it difficult to articulate why he did this particular thing at college, it would impede on his human right, on his freedom of speech. and that if America stands for anything, it's freedom of speech. So in effect, he's being told to shut up. And finally, very interestingly, his father loses his rag with him and beats him.
Oh, I see.
So he has literally been told to shut up in the name of peace by being beaten. So there's this weird paradox that she's very, very interested in, I think.
One of the things that always gets me, I like pulp rubbish films. I just swallow them up and watch them all the time. Netflix and helicopter gunship type of films. And I, you know, the films that I like are morally incredibly dubious because they always start with the premise. You know, often, you know, somebody's daughter has been kidnapped or something terrible has happened, such that the hero is justified in thereby inflicting terrible violence on anybody who comes into their purview, and it's legitimate violence, this sort of like myth of legitimate violence justified by something that's happened to them. And they are all pervasive, those films.
And it's often sentimental.
Yeah, very sentimental.
So which, as Winnicott once said, is sentimentality is the enemy of the truth. And that there's something about that kind of, like you see it in cop shows all the time.
Yes.
That, you know, you're allowed to beat a bad man in order to do a good thing.
Yes.
While you're doing to him exactly what he did to someone else.
Exactly right.
And, you know, some of the places that they send people for, you know, do you remember the short, sharp shock period? When they set up these borstalls where they said, you know, these guys were getting it too soft in the sort of young offender institutions. They set up the short, sharp shock, and, you know, this idea that you take a group of men who've been treated badly, boys, send them to a place, treat them worse, and think it would make them better.
Yes,
and they had to shut it down because they became absolute hotbeds of horrific violence from everyone. But people still have that, and we all have it. You know, I like a vengeance movie.
Yes.
You know,
No,
when you
that's
think,
right.
yes, get the
Yeah, that's right. It really.
You know,
But just you know,
Is it cathartic? I mean, sorry, just to come back to you talked about the way in which. So, because I want to know why I like them, and I was fascinated by what you said early on about you, because of your fascination with this, your work, and so you did some therapy, and the way in which you. I wrote it down. Is it? What do you use the word process or something like that? The way in which you process this violence. Now, I mean, I suspect that this may well be one of the ways in which we process violence. I mean, not always through very intelligent narratives. But nonetheless, it's a form of processing it.
Yeah, like crime fiction too.
Yes.
It's a way of trying to process something that I think is common to a lot of us, and that you know how. You know, and I worked for a while as an advisor to the British Board of Film Censors, and it was very interesting to sort of, you know, to think about the films and to think, is this damaging or not? I don't know. I'm not a great proponent of that idea that a film causes violence. I think people seek out violent films to manage something internally.
Didn't Clockwork Orange, didn't they? So one of the words that is often used around violence in violence theory and so forth is this idea of the mimetic, copying and so forth. And I always remember there was a sort of talk of after Clockwork Orange came out, and there's that scene where people kick a homeless man and you know, in the alleyway, and there was all sorts of copycats.
But the form violence can take surely will follow cultural things, but the impulse for it is not caused by the film.
I see. Is the theatre better than other forms of culture? I mean, I have a gut feeling that it might be, but why would that be the case?
What do you mean?
Well, that actually, there isn't that sort of the sort of genres of narrative about violence that are incredibly crass, that we're all, quite a lot of us, are addicted to. You don't really, you get a much more intelligence.
Well, I mean, theatre is not as good at spectacle as film or television, clearly. What it might be better at is dialogue, because people are more willing to sit and listen to people who are in the same room. I mean, that's it's a generalisation, but also certainly that's. I mean, again, to go back to Shin, that's why he has written for television, but he's mostly interested in theatre because he thinks people will be more likely to actually listen to the nuance of what's being said. I think
Tarantino's good at dialogue.
yeah, but it's kind of empty dialogue most of the time, isn't it? I mean, in my opinion, I like his films. What was my point? Yeah, to go back to this, the violence, the question of violence, and this idea that we've all got this underlying thing. I think there's also, I mean, when people make those connections between violent films and you know, people who've killed people or whatever, I think to some extent there's a kind of media desire to believe that also, that these things are connected. And there's a media desire very often to believe that we are all, underneath the civilised surface, deeply unpleasant, violent people. You see that, for example, one of the other things that I'm working on at the moment is a study of the Stanford prison experiment, famous psychology experiment, where, you know, allegedly what you do is you take these perfectly ordinary, nice young men and you divide them into guards and prisoners, you put them in an environment, and within 6 days they're being so horrible to each other you have to shut the experiment down. And that is taken very often to demonstrate this point that actually at root, when you take the veneer away, we're all animals, right? And yet actually when you look at that particular example, the guards were briefed to be unpleasant to the prisoners. And in fact, the lead most unpleasant guard, the most brutal one, whom I have interviewed at length, was a theatre major who, as far as he was concerned, was just doing what he'd been directed to do by the experimenter, okay? Which really like invalidates that as any kind of psychology experiment in certain respects, I would argue. But also if you look at, so to turn that around, if you look at a lot of disaster situations in the world, a lot of places where really horrible things have taken place, very often those are the situations where people actually turn out to be the best, you know, to be the most supportive of people, to be the most kind of willing to in disaster situations, or you know, people, again, to go back to the 9/11 example, people talk about how New Yorkers pulled together in the aftermath of that in ways that they'd never done before, you know. So yes, there's opportunism in any of those circumstances, but actually the evidence in a lot of contexts is the opposite, is that actually the good, the best of people comes out. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just ask about if there is a better political situation? Is there a sort of a political situation that you can point to, or a particular time in history that you can go, here are people living in this particular place, this particular time, where violence is not so important to their...
No, because I'm not that kind of a...
I see.
I'm not that kind of a thinker. I think every society has been involved in contexts of violent conflict. Violence doesn't just emerge; it's always related to conflict, whether it's, you know, an internal conflict within the self, or a conflict with others in a fight on the street. Gangland warfare and the violence used in gangland warfare is about territory and so on, and who controls what. And also in international politics, violence is always related to political issues, like who is an authority, who has the right to enact violence, who has the right to define friend and enemy, and so on and so on. In a sense, we all become engaged in this kind of discourse. But to go back to this idea of that was mentioned earlier in relation to we're in there because we're protecting human rights, or we're protecting women, the idea of to use violence as a form of rescue is once again has to be seen in its right political context, because to invoke human rights in the enactment of violence is in itself a violent, a violent act, and one has to look at how discourses of human rights have indeed legitimized acts, the most extreme acts.
But you can also argue, couldn't you, that in medicine, when I was a medical student, I was given permission to cut people, to hurt them, to put things into them, because it was in their best interest. Mm. And I was very interested later on, when I was reflecting on my training, how extraordinary that was. That, I'd be done for a grievous bodily harm, but that there is something about and it is a form of violence, but because of the intention of it, supposedly, which is why you need a proper structure, but that there is something about forms of violence being necessary to live.
Legitimate violence.
But
as
who,
being a very-
but who,
or if it means
but
the state being a monopoly.
who
is-
legislates for that? Who legislates for that legitimacy?
That's why you have to have an
Who is the
ethics.
sovereign being that legislates when is violent legitimate and
But isn't that the
when
nature of
it's
the
not?
state? I mean, isn't that one of the arguments about what the nature of the state is that the state is the body that has the monopoly on legitimate violence. I mean, that's one particular
Well,
theory of the
it's
state. isn't it?
it's the classic Weberian understanding of the state. But what's interesting now is that because we live, in a sense, in a context where sovereign power reaches well beyond the state, reaches out globally in a kind of 21st century mode of colonization. We have to ask the question. We in a democracy have to ask the question: who makes that decision, right? Because ultimately, violence is an act that proclaims he may live and she may die, or she may live and he may die. So this is the core of the question. The core of the question is who holds that power to decide what is legitimate violence and what is not.
And to add to the question of the state or the individual, there's also the question of religion, which bears very much on display, as I understand it, where the central character has kind of messianic fantasies on a certain level. I do know that Shin, in researching this play, was very drawn to a book called The Mark of the Sacred by a French philosopher called Jean-Pierre Dupuy, which basically argues that Christianity is of it argues that most religions are related to violence in certain ways, and of course the classic thing is to kind of cast out the scapegoat to take on the sins of the community, and we keep the community peaceful by ejecting the scapegoat. The pharmacon is in kind of classical literature and society, and Dupuy argues that the distinctive and important thing about Christianity as a religion is that it places the cast-out scapegoat at the centre.
This is Girard.
Yes, building
Girard.
on René Girard, at the centre of the picture, as it were. That the violence done onto the central character, as it were, is because it turns everything else on its head. Rather than casting it out, you put it in the middle. And I think that is that's a thought that will be worth bearing in mind with this play, I imagine. Not wishing to, not that I've even seen it yet. I
could talk for a lot.
Well, exactly.
Listen, we've got 15 more minutes. So if anybody wants to leap in,
It's kind of 3 minutes.
What's the time now? I said 20 minutes. I've got 22 on my watch.
Yeah, it's 1:45.
No, we can last a bit longer.
Oh, okay.
We've been told we can go on a bit longer than that. We can go on a bit longer than that.
I was interested in this discussion about whether we've made progress, because I think what we tend to forget is we talk about genocide now, and we refer to the genocide of the Armenians in the Tozan. But that concept is terribly modern. Until the Nuremberg trials, there was no even remote legal basis to describe.
It's Philip Sand's great book that's just come out, isn't
Gross
it?
violence. I mean, the state could do anything to its own people, and that was a matter for that state. So there has been, in my view, some progress, even if only conceptually, about gross violence.
My understanding of the people who are against Steven Pinker and so forth, my understanding is the anthropologists who are proper anthropologists, is that they say that the evidence is that war, and I'm going to be corrected here, war is roughly speaking about 10,000 years old, and that there's evidence of it, archaeological evidence in places like northern Iraq, funny enough, that goes back about that sort of time. But if you go back beyond that, it's actually hard to find evidence of the sort of collective violence that would be that you'd legitimately call war, and that human history is much, much longer. And that there's actually long periods of human time before then, this is one of the anthropological arguments, as I understand it, that actually human beings didn't live with war as... I mean, there was violence.
Too busy killing animals to eat.
There was all sorts of things. There was violence going on, but there wasn't the same degree of collective, organised violence that war would that would constitute war. So the idea that we've all been getting better and better and better, which doesn't accord with, I guess, my slightly darker view of the human heart, which I think I share with you. But nonetheless, there are times when we're not as organised to do it. I don't know if that.
I think just on this question of genocide. Genocide is an organised activity. It always is. Even when it appears not to be organised, even when neighbour takes the machete against neighbour, it's always organised by, can be the state, it can be intrastate structures and institutions, it can be the kind of language that's perpetrated within a society, the hatred that's perpetrated, I've been looking at, as it happens, at the Armenian genocide. It's very difficult to look at the Armenian genocide because there's so little on it. But I've been going through the archives, for example, one has to ask the question, because it was happening during the First World War, right? But also in that region, you had the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of a new Turkey, and then you had the French and British empires in that area. So I've been looking at, for example, how the Brits were responding to what they knew to be an emerging catastrophe as far as the Armenians and the Christian communities. It wasn't, by the way, just the Armenians, there were also other Christian communities in the Middle East. So, and it didn't just happen in Anatolia, it also happened in other regions of the Middle East. So it's very interesting how someone sitting within a government or within a diplomatic corps can come to a consciousness and an understanding that something is happening that's directed against a population. It's just been really a fascinating story because it's such a recurring story, and now it's happening in Burma as well, of course. So.
But to pick up on the organisation thing as well, presumably the history that you're enacting, the however many thousands of years ago that we first see war, that's because that's the first stage at which civilization has got to that degree of organisation to have an organised conflict. And to go back to the Pinker thesis, I think what we've done over the last couple of hundred years is simply sublimate violence in particular ways rather than remove it. I mean, if you look at prisons, are a really interesting example where people used to be hung, drawn and quartered and all kinds of horrible violence done to the body. But if you read, for example, Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he identifies that within about a 20 or 30-year period, you go from that kind of extreme violence to people being quietly locked up in cells. And of course, the invention of the prison cell is, the word itself comes from the monk's cell. Is that what's happening at that point is the idea that rather than murdering the body or flagellating the body, what we're going to do is try and change your mind. Okay, we're going to impose certain kinds of moral judgment on you. And when you think about it, actually, prison sentence is a really odd thing. Like somebody's committed an act of violence, maybe spontaneously in the moment, and what the state does to you is take a certain amount of time from you to think about what you've done. And probably, in most prisons these days, given the lack of guard presence in the UK, there'll be more violence to come. That's so what we do is hide it and repress it. In the United States, we put half of the black population in prison instead of having slavery.
I'm so glad you mentioned Michel Foucault because he writes about that instance of the guillotine coming down and there has to be an audience.
Yes.
Why does there have to be an audience? Because it's the way in which the state asserts its sovereign power. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, if you look at the discourse, the official discourses around the invasion of Iraq, and at the very outset, shock and awe. Yeah. Shock and awe is a military doctrine. Mm-hmm. it wasn't just about defeating the army of the enemy, it was about having that global audience to watch it. It was a spectacle, right? Just as 9/11.
It was the answer to 9/11, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you feel, as a profession, I'm asking you as a representative, got at by Foucault a bit?
Not really, because it seems to me that, it goes back to the earlier point. I worked in a state-sanctioned place. I could deprive people of civil liberties. I have the potential to section people under the Mental Health Act. And therefore, it's essential that you exist in a place where there's active discourse with people who disagree or challenge. And that's why courts can be so helpful, or tribunals. And, I've shifted over that, because I used to get a bit defensive, there's a tribunal, and I'm going to be sort of, my judgment is going to be questioned. And I think, good, because I need to stand up for it, and it needs to be tested.
Right, we're going to be really, really quick. Gentleman here.
I'm intrigued by the idea that you mentioned about violence against oneself and the idea of violence within oneself. One thing that I think always strikes me is that we've talked a bit about the state having responsibility for violence, but surely really the first responsibility is the self in actually understanding the quantity of violence, the propensity of violence, which is actually internal.
But it's
I'm going to go for. We've got so little time. I'm going to go for all the other people who put their hand up, and then we're going to come back. I'm ever so sorry to do that, because otherwise we're going to get kicked off with the play coming. Really sorry, Claire.
My question is the level of violence that I've seen rise in the past 10 years, which is online violence.
Yeah.
And it's something that, I think we talk a lot about governments and talk a lot about wars, and historically it's what we have seen documented, that the rise of protecting everyone through social networks has led to something we didn't expect. Social networks is supposed to be a good thing, but we've seen violence rise. And then special interest groups use social networks to push their agendas. And so, how do you guys think
That's
that
very
this type of violence influence is influenced?
So there's three people. So this young gentleman here.
The other thing I just wanted to come back to was that we were talking about the idea that we've kind of moved past a certain stage of violence and we're now going back and reducing our violence. But I think it's a very Western idea that we reduce our violence, because it's almost a privilege now to even know that violence is happening, that the state is what violence that the state is perpetrating. So if you look at, arms sales to
Saudi Arabia.
yeah, and if you look at the conflict in Yemen, it's almost like
Exactly right.
it's a privilege to even know that violence is happening, and then it's a privilege to be able to disagree.
Good
So,
point.
yeah.
Building on what was said before, I think it's more that our perception of violence has changed, that the actual violence that has been occurring for thousands and thousands of years has stayed the same. That's because for quite a lot of us, as I said, like in the West, kind of very distant concept that the violence is actually going on, and the mundane violence has kind of dictated a lot of people's lives has changed.
I have 2 points. One, that whether violence is decreasing or escalating, and the other was your point about beyond the country's borders. I've been mentoring an Afghan for the last year before he goes to university, and I said about going back, and he broke down to tears. I can't go back. And I said, well, what was it like? And he said, we've always had warlords. They've always fought. But then the big powers came in and financed them and fed them and escalated that violence, and now it's not controllable. I can't go back.
We've had a great discussion. We've got 2 minutes, but I don't know if anybody would just like. Can I give you all a minute just to
Can I just say something about the individual? Because I think certainly in my work, it's very important to understand the wider context. But in the end, it's me with the patient trying to help somebody, and the language is very important. And a lot of the language in psychiatry is very mealy-mouthed. I think deliberate self-harm, when somebody's really cutting themselves, is not a good enough word. And I will say to the patient, that's a form of violence, and it's like a huge shock that it's a kind of attempted self-murder or something attack. But I just sort of feel that the understanding is really important in the wider context, but you also have to think about the person sitting with you.
I would say violence is not simply instrumental, it's also constitutive. It says a lot about the constitution of the subject of violence. And I totally agree with the young man sitting on the third row in relation to our perceptions of where violence takes place. And I understand that in the play, maybe the first sentence is go and find violence, as if it's kind of somewhere over there, but then he finds that it's actually already here.
And I would say no progress is made in the world without violence. Paradoxically, even if you look at the civil rights movement, for example, the disciplined non-violence, it always knew it was going to bring violence upon itself, and that would be how progress was made. The epigraph to Shin's play, Now or Later, is be bloody or be nothing, from Hamlet. So it's worth thinking about.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed.